Tonight, we will travel through the layered world of Victorian England, where gardens bloomed in careful symmetry, where tea ceremonies marked the rhythm of afternoon hours, and where city streets teemed with voices, smoke, and the endless motion of a society transforming itself. As night falls over the gardens of Kensington, over the foggy lanes of London, over the terraced streets of Manchester, we begin a journey into a time when nature was carefully curated, when social rituals governed every gesture, and when an entire civilization was caught between the elegance of tradition and the thundering arrival of the modern age. There are mysteries embedded in the everyday life of this era, secrets about how people moved through their days, about what they saw and smelled and touched, about the invisible structures that shaped their existence. Some of these secrets will emerge only gradually, like fog lifting from the Thames at dawn. The story of Victorian England is not one story but many, woven together across decades that stretched from 1837 to 1901, during the long reign of Queen Victoria. It is a story written in the architecture of conservatories, in the steam rising from teacups, in the coal smoke that settled over urban rooftops, in the carefully cultivated flower beds that lined the pathways of public parks. To understand this world, we must move through it slowly, observing its textures and rhythms, feeling the temperature of its seasons, listening to the sounds that filled its streets and drawing rooms. We must pay attention to the surfaces of things, the polished wooden floors of middle-class homes, the rough cobblestones of working-class neighborhoods, the glass panels of newly constructed greenhouses, because these surfaces tell us how people lived, what they valued, and what they endured. Begin with the gardens. In the early decades of Victoria's reign, a transformation was taking place in how the English understood their relationship with cultivated nature. The naturalistic landscapes of the 18th century, with their rolling hills and artfully placed trees, gave way to something more structured, more ornamental, more deliberately designed. Gardens became architectural spaces, extensions of the home itself, places where symmetry and order could be imposed upon the natural world. This shift reflected broader changes in society, the rise of the middle class, the expansion of empire, the increasing availability of exotic plants brought back from distant colonies, the development of new technologies that made glass more affordable and greenhouses more accessible. Victorian garden design was not merely about beauty. It was about control, about demonstrating mastery over nature, about displaying wealth and sophistication through careful arrangement of color and form. The typical Victorian garden featured geometric flower beds arranged in precise patterns, circles, ovals, rectangles, stars, filled with densely packed plantings that created vivid displays of color. These beds were often described as carpet bedding because they resembled the intricate patterns of oriental carpets, with plants chosen for uniformity of height and vibrancy of hue rather than for individual botanical interest. Red salvias blazed against white, sweet alyssum. Purple ageratum bordered beds of golden coleus. Scarlet geraniums, or pelargoniums, as they were more properly known, stood in regimented rows, their reliable blooms lasting from late spring through the first frosts of autumn. The Victorians loved geraniums with an almost obsessive devotion, growing them in pots on windowsills, in urns on terraces, in massive displays in public parks. The scent of geranium leaves, crushed between fingers, became synonymous with summer afternoons in English gardens. But carpet bedding was only one aspect of Victorian garden design. There were also rockeries, carefully constructed arrangements of stone that mimicked natural outcroppings, planted with ferns and alpine species. There were shrubberies, dense plantings of evergreen, and deciduous shrubs that created enclosed spaces within the garden, perfect for private conversations or solitary contemplation. There were winding gravel paths that led visitors on prescribed routes through the landscape, revealing carefully composed views at strategic intervals. There were arbors draped with climbing roses and clematis, creating shaded retreats where one could sit on iron benches and observe the garden's changing moods. There were lawns, kept trimmed and green through the use of the newly invented lawnmower, patented in 1830 and quickly adopted by gardeners eager to replace the laborious process of scything by hand. The plants themselves told stories of empire and exploration. Dahlias, introduced from Mexico, became Victorian favorites for their large, showy blooms in deep reds, purples, oranges, and yellows. Chrysanthemums from Asia added late-season color when most other flowers had faded. Roses, especially the new hybrid varieties developed through careful breeding, were essential to any respectable garden, their blooms ranging from pure white through every shade of pink, red, and even yellow. Hollyhocks lined the backs of borders, their tall spikes of papery flowers creating vertical accents against walls and fences. Foxgloves, with their tubular purple, pink, or white blooms arranged along slender stalks, brought height and drama to shaded areas, though gardeners were well aware of their toxic properties. Sweet peas climbed trellises and fences, valued more for their delicate fragrance than for their modest flowers, a scent that could transport one, momentarily, away from the grime and noise of Victorian cities. Peonies held special significance in Victorian gardens. These herbaceous perennials, with their enormous, many-petaled blooms and rich fragrance, symbolized prosperity and good fortune. They were favored for weddings and celebrations, their flowers so full and lush that a single bloom could fill a small vase. Peonies required patience. Young plants might take several years to reach full flowering maturity, but once established, they could live for decades, becoming cherished features of family gardens, their annual bloom a marker of spring's transition into early summer. The most admired varieties were the doubles, with layer upon layer of silky petals in shades of pink, white, and deep crimson, their weight so substantial that the stems often required staking to prevent them from bowing to the ground. Lavender formed fragrant hedges along pathways, its gray-green foliage providing textural contrast, and its purple flower spikes attracting bees throughout the summer months. Wisteria, that vigorous climbing vine from Asia, was trained against the walls of houses, its cascading racemes of purple or white flowers creating spectacular displays in late spring. Hydrangeas, preferring the moist, acidic soils of certain regions, produced massive globular flower heads that changed color according to soil chemistry: pink in alkaline soil, blue in acidic conditions. Victorian gardeners delighted in this natural alchemy, experimenting with amendments to achieve their desired hues. The formal gardens of great estates went beyond mere flower beds. At Broadsworth Hall in Yorkshire, laid out in the 1860s in the Italianate style, the gardens featured elaborate parterres, ornamental arrangements of flower beds forming patterns, alongside graveled terraces, ornamental fountains, and carefully clipped hedges. At Rest Park in Bedfordshire, Earl de Grey created gardens in the French formal style to complement his new house, with scrollwork flower beds, lead statuary, and water features that harked back to the grand gardens of continental Europe. These gardens were designed to be viewed from the house, their patterns best appreciated from upper floor windows, where the geometric complexity could be fully comprehended. Yet, there was also a romantic streak in Victorian garden design, inherited from the landscape movement of earlier decades. Larger gardens incorporated elements of the picturesque, winding paths that disappeared around corners, sudden views across ornamental lakes, strategically placed trees that framed vistas, secluded grottos lined with ferns and moss. This tension between formality and naturalism, between control and wildness, reflected broader anxieties in Victorian culture, caught as it was between tradition and modernity, between the pastoral ideal and the industrial reality. The development of the conservatory represented perhaps the ultimate expression of Victorian mastery over nature. These glass structures, attached to houses or freestanding in gardens, created controlled microclimates where tropical and subtropical plants could thrive despite England's cool, damp weather. The technology that made large-scale glass construction possible, advances in iron casting, improvements in glass manufacturing that produced larger, clearer panes at lower cost, was the same technology that drove the Industrial Revolution. The Palm House at Kew Gardens, completed between 1844 and 1848, was at the time the largest greenhouse in the world, its wrought iron framework supporting vast expanses of glass, its interior housing palms, ferns, orchids, and other exotic species brought back by Victorian explorers and plant hunters. For wealthy families, a conservatory was both a status symbol and a place of pleasure. These glass sanctuaries extended the living space of the house while maintaining a connection to the garden. Inside a well-appointed conservatory, one might find climbing vines trained along the ironwork, potted palms creating vertical accents, beds of begonias and coleus providing colorful ground cover, orchids displayed on special benches, citrus trees bearing fruit, even banana plants with their enormous tropical leaves. The air inside was warm and humid, perfumed with the scent of flowers and damp earth, a stark contrast to the often chilly rooms of the main house. The conservatory served multiple functions, as a display of horticultural prowess, as an entertaining space for afternoon gatherings, as a retreat for reading or painting or quiet conversation, as a place where the usual strict conventions of Victorian social behavior might be slightly relaxed. The temperature inside these glass structures required careful management. Elaborate heating systems using coal-fired boilers and networks of pipes maintained warmth during winter months. Ventilation systems with opening panels in the roof prevented overheating in summer. Watering was a constant task, as was the battle against pests, aphids, scale insects, spider mites that thrived in the warm, protected environment. Gardeners developed specialized knowledge about the requirements of different tropical species, experimenting with soil mixtures, humidity levels, and light exposure to keep their charges healthy and flowering. But most people did not have conservatories or large gardens. For the growing urban population, packed into terraced houses in rapidly expanding industrial cities, outdoor space was severely limited. Working-class homes might have only a small backyard used for practical purposes, hanging laundry, keeping a privy, perhaps growing a few vegetables. The notion of a purely ornamental garden was a luxury they could scarcely imagine. Yet even in these constrained spaces, there might be a pot of geraniums on a windowsill, a climbing rose trained against a wall, a patch of herbs by the kitchen door. The human desire for growing things, for a connection to the natural world, persisted even in the grimmest urban settings. This is where the Victorian public park enters the story. But that story must wait for a moment, because to understand the full significance of these urban green spaces, we must first understand the cities themselves, the unprecedented transformation of British society that created the need for what would be called the lungs of the city. The Victorian city was a contradiction, a marvel, and a nightmare simultaneously. London, the largest city in the world by the mid-19th century, swelled from just over 1 million inhabitants in 1801 to more than 6.5 million by the end of Victoria's reign. Other cities experienced similar explosive growth. Manchester's population increased from around 100,000 at the turn of the 19th century to over 500,000 by 1851, earning it the nickname Cottonopolis for its dominance of the textile industry. Birmingham, Sheffield, Leeds, Glasgow, all these cities expanded rapidly, their growth driven by factories and mills that drew workers from the countryside in search of employment, creating urban landscapes unlike anything the world had previously seen. The streets of Victorian cities were places of constant motion and noise. Cobblestones, uneven and treacherous when wet, rang with the sound of iron-shod horse hooves, the grinding of wooden cartwheels, the cries of street vendors. The cacophony was overwhelming. The shouts of costermongers selling fruit and vegetables from carts, the calls of milk sellers and muffin men, the bells of rag-and-bone collectors seeking cast-off items to salvage and resell, the songs of crossing sweepers who cleared paths through the mud and dung for pedestrians willing to pay a penny, the rumble of heavy wagons hauling coal and goods, the sharper clip of private carriages carrying the wealthy through the crowded thoroughfares. Imagine standing on a busy London street on a Saturday evening in the 1870s. The market is in full swing, gas lamps creating pools of yellow light along the pavements, their flames hissing and flickering. The air is thick with smells, roasting chestnuts from a corner brazier, the fishy odor of oysters displayed on ice at a stall, the yeasty scent of fresh bread from a baker's shop, the acrid tang of coal smoke settling over everything, the less pleasant odors of horse droppings not yet swept away, of unwashed bodies pressed close together, of the Thames at low tide releasing its fetid perfume. Every shop and stall blazes with light, merchants having learned that bright illumination attracts customers. Women in thick shawls move slowly through the crowd, market baskets over their arms, stopping to examine produce, haggling over prices, testing the freshness of fish with experienced fingers. The crowds themselves represented every level of Victorian society, though carefully maintaining the invisible boundaries of class even as they jostled together in public spaces. Wealthy women, chaperoned and carefully dressed in the latest fashions, might venture into certain respectable shopping districts during prescribed hours, 3 to 6 in the afternoon, being generally acceptable for paying social calls or making purchases. Their clothing, elaborate dresses with fitted bodices and full skirts supported by layers of petticoats, or later in the period by bustles, marked their status unmistakably. The fabrics were rich: silk, satin, velvet, fine wool. The colors, especially after the development of synthetic dyes in the 1850s, could be remarkably vibrant: mauve, magenta, brilliant blues and greens that would have been impossible to achieve with earlier vegetable dyes. Trimmings were lavish: ruffles, flounces, ribbons, lace, embroidery. all made more affordable by the invention of the sewing machine in the 1840s. Middle-class women wore similar styles but in less expensive fabrics and with fewer embellishments. Working-class women dressed practically, in simple skirts and bodices made from sturdy cotton or wool, their clothing chosen for durability rather than fashion, though even the poorest tried to maintain some standard of respectability in their appearance, keeping their clothes as clean as circumstances permitted. The working woman's shawl was ubiquitous, serving as coat, blanket, and baby carrier as circumstances required. Men's fashion was more somber across all classes. Dark colors predominated: black, gray, brown, in suits that varied in quality of fabric and cut, but followed similar basic patterns. Top hats for the wealthy, flat caps for workers. The Victorian gentleman was expected to maintain a dignified appearance at all times, his clothing a reflection of his character and social standing. Facial hair was enormously popular. Mustaches, mutton chops, full beards, styled with care and sometimes waxed to hold elaborate shapes. The architecture of Victorian cities reflected the era's technological advances and economic ambitions. Railway stations were built on unprecedented scales, their soaring iron and glass roofs covering vast platforms where steam locomotives hissed and clanked, their designs borrowing from cathedral architecture to create secular temples of commerce and progress. The railways themselves transformed Victorian life in ways that are difficult to overstate. The first public railway, the Stockton and Darlington, opened in 1825. By 1870, Britain had 16,000 miles of track, carrying 423 million passengers annually. By the end of Victoria's reign, that number had increased to over 1 billion passenger journeys per year. The railway made possible the suburbs, allowing middle-class workers to live outside the city center and commute daily to their offices. It transformed food distribution, enabling fresh milk, vegetables, and fish to reach urban markets from distant farms and ports. It standardized time itself. Previously, each town had kept its own local time based on the sun's position, but the railways required synchronized schedules, leading to the adoption of railway time and eventually to the time zones we still use today. It changed patterns of leisure, making day trips to the seaside accessible to working-class families who had previously never ventured beyond their immediate neighborhoods. Victorian station architecture celebrated this transformation. St. Pancras Station in London, completed in 1868, combined a soaring train shed with a Gothic Revival hotel building that looked more like a medieval palace than a commercial structure. The juxtaposition of cutting-edge engineering. The train shed used 25 million bricks and required innovative truss designs to span its width without internal supports, with historical architectural styles typified Victorian approaches to building. They wanted their new industrial world to have the gravitas and cultural legitimacy that historical styles conveyed. Office buildings, banks, civic buildings, all adopted revival styles: Gothic Revival, Classical Revival, Italianate, applied to structures whose purposes and construction methods were entirely modern. The Houses of Parliament, rebuilt after a fire in 1834, exemplified Gothic Revival architecture with their pointed arches, decorative pinnacles, and medieval-inspired ornamental details, all meticulously applied to a building that served the needs of modern parliamentary democracy. Churches, too, were built or rebuilt in historical styles, particularly Gothic, which was seen as appropriately spiritual and English. Domestic architecture varied enormously by class. At the top of the social hierarchy, The aristocracy and wealthy industrialists built or maintained grand country houses, sprawling estates with dozens of rooms, elaborate gardens, and armies of servants. These houses might be Italianate villas with low-pitched roofs and round-arched windows, or Gothic revival structures with turrets and steep gables, or neoclassical mansions with columned porticos. Inside, they featured high ceilings, ornate plasterwork, hardwood floors, grand staircases with carved wooden banisters, multiple drawing rooms and parlors, libraries, music rooms, conservatories, and separate wings for servants' quarters. The growing middle class aspired to own their own homes, and Victorian builders obliged by constructing thousands of terraced houses in expanding suburbs. These houses, built in long rows sharing party walls, offered comfortable middle-class living, separate rooms for different functions, bay windows to maximize light, small front gardens enclosed by iron railings, larger back gardens for private family use. Inside, there might be a tiled entrance hall, a front parlor for receiving guests, a back parlor used as family dining room or sitting room, a kitchen in the basement or at the back, several bedrooms upstairs. The most prosperous middle-class families might afford a small conservatory or glass extension at the rear, bringing light into back rooms and providing space for potted plants. These middle-class Victorian houses, with their characteristic features, sash windows, ornate fireplaces with tiled surrounds, picture rails, decorative cornicing, patterned tile floors and hallways, still define the character of many British neighborhoods. They were built to last, constructed of brick or stone, with attention to detail in decorative elements like carved wooden barge boards on gables, colored glass in front doors, iron balconies on upper floors. Working-class housing was far less comfortable. In rapidly industrializing cities, workers were packed into cheaply built terraced houses, often with multiple families sharing single dwellings. These houses were small, dark, poorly ventilated, lacking proper sanitation. In the worst slums, entire families might occupy a single room, with shared outdoor privies serving dozens of residents, with no running water beyond a standpipe in the courtyard, with inadequate drainage leading to fetid conditions that bred disease. The contrast between these squalid neighborhoods and the elegant squares where the wealthy resided, sometimes only streets apart, was stark and troubling, fueling social reformers' calls for improved housing standards and public health measures. The atmosphere of Victorian cities was literally thick with smoke. Coal powered everything. The factories, the railways, the domestic fires that heated homes and cooked food. On cold, still days, the smoke settled over the cities, combining with natural fog to create the phenomenon known as pea super, a dense, yellow-brown, choking miasma that reduced visibility to a few feet and left a grimy residue on every surface. Charles Dickens described these fogs memorably in his novels, capturing their oppressive, disorienting quality. The fog was not merely water vapor, but a toxic mixture of water droplets, coal smoke, and industrial pollutants. True smog, though that term would not be coined until the 20th century. London's geography exacerbated the problem. Situated in a river valley, prone to temperature inversions where cold air near the ground was trapped beneath a layer of warmer air above, the city's pollutants could not disperse upward, instead accumulating near street level. The narrow streets and tall buildings created urban canyons where air circulation was poor, allowing the fog to linger for days. During particularly severe fog episodes, Transportation ceased, businesses closed, people died from respiratory ailments. Yet Londoners accepted the fog as an inevitable part of urban life, something to endure with characteristic British stoicism, even as it blackened buildings, killed vegetation, and shortened lives. By mid-century, though, awareness was growing that something must be done about the abysmal living conditions in industrial cities. Disease was rampant. Cholera outbreaks killed thousands. Typhoid fever spread through contaminated water supplies. Tuberculosis thrived in overcrowded, poorly ventilated housing. Infant mortality was appalling, with nearly 1 in 4 children dying before their 5th birthday, the rate even higher in the poorest neighborhoods. Reformers like Edwin Chadwick documented these conditions in reports that shocked middle-class readers, arguing that improved sanitation, clean water, and adequate housing were not merely moral imperatives, but practical necessities. It was in this context, cities choked with smoke, streets teeming with humanity, working-class neighborhoods lacking any green space, that the Victorian public park movement emerged. The idea was revolutionary: to create large, free, accessible parks within urban areas, providing what landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted would call the lungs of the city. These parks would offer working-class residents access to fresh air, natural beauty, and healthy recreation, improving both their physical health and their moral character. The Victorians believed strongly in the improving power of nature and in the importance of providing alternatives to what they saw as the degrading leisure pursuits of the poor: drinking, gambling, violence. The parks that were created during the Victorian era became defining features of British cities, many surviving to the present day as beloved public spaces. They followed certain design principles: large lawns for informal recreation, winding paths for walking, ornamental lakes with boating facilities, varied planting including both native and exotic species, bandstands for musical performances, fountains and monuments as focal points. The design intentionally evoked the countryside, creating an idealized natural landscape within the city, though one carefully maintained by teams of gardeners who kept the grass mowed, the beds weeded, the paths raked. Sefton Park in Liverpool, opened in 1872 and covering 235 acres, exemplified the Victorian public park. Its design included a large ornamental lake, a palm house conservatory, extensive plantings of exotic trees and shrubs, meandering pathways, and open spaces for various activities. The park was intended to be beautiful, but also functional, providing spaces for promenading, for children's play, for organized sports, for quiet contemplation. Significantly, the park was free and open to all classes, though social divisions persisted in how different groups used the space and when they visited. These public parks served multiple purposes. They were places for healthy exercise, walking being the primary form, though later in the period activities like cycling and tennis would be incorporated. They were venues for entertainment. Band concerts on Sunday afternoons drew large crowds, with brass bands performing popular tunes and classical pieces, the music floating across the lawns while families spread blankets and listened. They were educational spaces where urban dwellers could encounter unfamiliar plants and trees, their labels providing botanical information, cultivating an interest in natural history. They were social spaces where courting couples could walk together under a degree of supervision less rigid than would be permitted in private homes, where families could gather for outings, where neighbors could meet and converse. The parks also contained more exotic features. Zoological collections became popular additions, allowing urban children to see animals from other continents: bears, lions, elephants, exotic birds, creatures that existed otherwise only in book illustrations or travelers' tales. These early zoos reflected Victorian attitudes toward empire and natural history, presenting the animals as curiosities to be observed and studied. Specimens collected from distant colonies now displayed for the edification and entertainment of the British public. The design of these parks was influenced by major landscape designers of the era. Joseph Paxton, who had designed the spectacular Crystal Palace for the Great Exhibition of 1851, applied his talents to park design. John Claudius Loudon, a Scottish horticulturist and garden designer, advocated for public parks and influenced their development through his writings. These designers understood that parks needed to balance aesthetic beauty with practical functionality, creating spaces that could withstand heavy use while maintaining their appeal. The parks were carefully maintained by teams of gardeners and groundskeepers. The extensive bedding displays, tens of thousands of plants arranged in elaborate patterns, required planning months in advance, with greenhouses producing the necessary plants, with seasonal changeovers in spring and autumn involving massive replanting efforts. The labor was intensive, but it created spectacular results. Beds of brilliant salvias shaped like stars, carpet patterns in begonias and alyssum, borders of golden coleus alternating with purple lobelias. These displays were points of civic pride, with neighboring parks competing to create the most impressive arrangements. Access to the parks was regulated. Gates were locked at night to prevent vagrancy and immoral behavior. Rules prohibited picking flowers, walking on the grass in some areas, holding political meetings, playing certain games. The parks were meant to be respectable spaces where proper behavior was enforced, offering wholesome recreation rather than opportunities for disorder. This regulation reflected Victorian class anxieties, the fear that the working classes, given access to public spaces, might behave in ways that threatened social stability. Yet despite these restrictions, the parks were genuinely popular and served an important function in Victorian city life. They provided accessible beauty in often grim urban environments. They offered spaces where different classes might encounter each other, if not as equals, at least as fellow users of public amenities. They represented a recognition that urban planning needed to account for human needs beyond mere housing and employment. That quality of life mattered, that access to nature, even carefully cultivated, highly managed nature, was a public good worth investing in. Beyond the parks, other forms of public green space emerged. Cemetery design became an art form, with large burial grounds like Kensal Green in London, opened in 1831, conceived as landscape gardens filled with monuments, trees, and winding paths. These garden cemeteries served dual purposes, as burial grounds and as parks where the living could walk and contemplate mortality in pleasant surroundings. The monuments themselves ranged from simple headstones to elaborate Gothic memorials, Egyptian obelisks, classical urns, and sculptural groups, creating open-air museums of Victorian funerary art. Botanical gardens expanded and professionalized during the Victorian era. The Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, which had existed in various forms since the 18th century, opened to the public in 1840 and became a center for botanical research and plant collection. Kew Gardens accumulated plants from around the world, studying their properties, attempting their cultivation, distributing seeds and specimens to other gardens and colonies. The famous Palm House and later the Temperate House created controlled environments where tropical and subtropical plants could be displayed and studied. For Victorian visitors, a trip to Kew offered education and spectacle, the chance to see plants from climates they would never personally experience, to walk through landscapes that evoked distant corners of the empire. The relationship between gardens, parks, and empire was significant. Victorian plant hunters traveled to remote regions, the Himalayas, China, South America, Africa, collecting specimens that would transform British horticulture. Rhododendrons from Asia became staples of British woodland gardens. Rubber trees from South America were studied and propagated, eventually establishing the plantation economies of British colonies in Southeast Asia. The Victoria amazonica, the giant water lily from South America with leaves strong enough to support a child's weight, became a sensation when successfully cultivated in England. Its enormous blooms and massive floating leaves, symbols of both horticultural achievement and imperial reach. This connection between plants and empire extended into the home. The fernery craze that swept Victorian Britain in the mid-19th century, pteridamania as it was called, involved cultivating native and exotic ferns in dedicated cases, rockeries, and shaded garden areas. Ferns became immensely fashionable, their delicate fronds appreciated for their beauty, collected obsessively, illustrated in books and decorative arts. The Wardian case, a sealed glass container invented in the 1830s, allowed ferns and other moisture-loving plants to be grown indoors, creating miniature landscapes that required little maintenance. These cases also revolutionized plant transport, allowing living specimens to survive long sea voyages, thereby facilitating the movement of plants between continents that built the Victorian botanical empire. Now we must turn to a ritual that became quintessentially Victorian, though its origins lay earlier in the century: the taking of afternoon tea. This ceremony, seemingly simple, the serving of tea with light food in the late afternoon, became laden with social meaning, governed by elaborate etiquette and central to middle and upper class social life. Understanding afternoon tea requires understanding the broader context of Victorian daily schedules, meal patterns, and social customs. Before the Victorian era, British meal times had been different. Dinner, the main meal, had traditionally been served in the early afternoon, followed by a light supper in the evening. As the 19th century progressed, dinner moved later and later in the day, eventually settling around 7 or 8 o'clock in the evening for the upper and middle classes. This shift was enabled by improvements in artificial lighting, first oil lamps, then gas lighting, eventually electric lights, that made evening activities more practical and pleasant. But this late dinner time created a long gap between lunch, typically taken around noon or 1 o'clock, and the evening meal. By 4 or 5 in the afternoon, people felt hungry and in need of refreshment. The story, perhaps apocryphal but widely repeated, attributes the invention of afternoon tea to Anna Russell, the Duchess of Bedford, in the 1840s. Finding herself hungry in the late afternoon, the Duchess began requesting a tray of tea, bread and butter, and cake to be brought to her room. She enjoyed this so much that she began inviting friends to join her, and the practice spread through her social circle and eventually throughout society. Whether or not this story is precisely accurate, it captures the way afternoon tea developed, initially as a private indulgence, then as a social occasion, finally as an established ritual with its own rules and expectations. By the 1850s and 1860s, afternoon tea had become an institution. It was typically served between 4 and 5 o'clock, either in the drawing room of a private home or in one of the fashionable tea rooms that began to open in cities. The essential elements were tea, served in fine china teacups with matching saucers, poured from a silver or china teapot, milk and sugar offered separately, and food, delicate sandwiches with the crusts removed, scones with jam and clotted cream, small cakes and pastries. The food had to be manageable without cutlery, as guests would be holding teacups and saucers and could not easily manipulate knives and forks. The etiquette of afternoon tea was complex. The hostess poured the tea, a privilege not delegated to servants for such an intimate social occasion. The tea had to be prepared correctly, the right proportion of tea leaves to water, brewed for the proper length of time, neither too weak nor too strong. There was debate about whether to pour milk into the cup before or after the tea. Both methods had their adherents, and choosing correctly might mark one as properly educated in tea etiquette or reveal one's social ignorance. Sugar, once enormously expensive and a luxury good, had become more affordable by the Victorian era, but the number of lumps one took still carried class implications. Too much suggested lower-class tastes. Too little might seem affected. The teacups themselves were markers of status. Fine bone china, thin enough to be translucent, decorated with hand-painted floral patterns or gilt trim, arranged on silver trays. These items represented significant investments and were displayed with pride. Tea sets might be family heirlooms, passed down through generations, or new purchases chosen to reflect the latest aesthetic fashions. The arrangement of the tea table was an art. The placement of the teapot, the positioning of the milk jug and sugar bowl, the careful display of the food on tiered cake stands, everything designed to create an impression of refined elegance. The tea itself had become deeply embedded in British culture by this time. Although tea drinking had been introduced to England in the 17th century, initially as an expensive luxury, by the Victorian era, it had become the national beverage, consumed by all classes. The tea trade with China had expanded enormously in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, with British merchants importing vast quantities. When conflicts with China disrupted this trade, the British developed tea plantations in India, Assam and later Darjeeling, and Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, creating an empire-based tea supply chain. By the later Victorian period, Indian and Ceylon teas had become the standard, black teas with robust flavors that stood up well to the addition of milk. The importance of tea to Victorian culture cannot be overstated. It was served at every meal, breakfast, lunch, afternoon tea, after dinner. It was offered to visitors regardless of the time of day. It was consumed in vast quantities at all levels of society, from the elaborate afternoon teas of the wealthy to the strong, heavily sugared brew that sustained factory workers through long shifts. Tea was associated with domesticity, with comfort, with proper English behavior. The tea table was a space where women particularly exercised social power as hostess and tea pourer, managing the rituals and conversations that took place around this shared beverage. Afternoon tea gatherings served important social functions. They were occasions for women to meet and converse, to maintain social networks, to exchange information and gossip, to arrange marriages and other family matters. Men might sometimes join these gatherings, though afternoon tea was considered primarily a female domain, in contrast to the male-dominated dining room where serious dinners took place. The conversation at tea was expected to be light, pleasant, appropriate. Politics and business were generally avoided. Topics like fashion, books, music, mutual acquaintances, and social events being more suitable. The tea gathering might include music as entertainment. Victorian middle and upper-class homes typically contained a piano, and young ladies were expected to have some musical accomplishment. After tea, guests might retire to the music room or drawing room, where someone would perform songs, piano pieces, perhaps duets. The music chosen was carefully calibrated to demonstrate skill without seeming boastful, to entertain without overwhelming. Sheet music was widely available, published by companies that catered to the amateur home musician. Popular songs, ballads, waltzes, simplified arrangements of classical pieces. These formed the repertoire of the Victorian parlor. Tea rooms and tea shops opened to serve those who could not entertain at home or who wanted public venues for social gatherings. Establishments like Twinings and Fortnum and Mason in London, both dating from the 18th century but flourishing in the Victorian era, became famous for the quality of their teas and the elegance of their surroundings. These venues offered not just tea, but an experience. Beautifully appointed rooms, attentive service, a setting where middle-class women could meet independently of male supervision, a public space that was respectable and safe. High tea was a different meal altogether, though the terms are often confused. High tea was a substantial evening meal eaten by working-class families and in northern England and Scotland, typically around 6 o'clock, combining elements of tea and supper. It might include meat, fish, bread, cheese, cakes, a full meal rather than the light refreshments of afternoon tea. The term high referred to the high table at which it was eaten, a dinner table rather than the low tables of the drawing room, not to any particular refinement or elegance. The rhythm of the Victorian day was structured by meal times, work schedules, social obligations, and household routines that varied dramatically by class. For the wealthy, the day began late and proceeded at a leisurely pace. A servant would bring hot water for washing and a light breakfast tray, tea or coffee with something small to eat, to the bedroom around 8 or 9 o'clock. The next hour or two would be spent in private activities, dressing with the help of a lady's maid or valet, attending to correspondence, reading. A substantial breakfast would be served mid-morning, perhaps around 10 or 11, in the dining room. This meal might include eggs, bacon, sausages, kidneys, kedgeree, a rice dish with fish and eggs imported from India, toast, preserves, fresh fruit. The family and any house guests would gather, though not necessarily at the same time. People came and went according to their own schedules. After breakfast, the day's activities commenced. For men, this might mean attending to business matters, estate management, correspondence with their bankers or solicitors, or recreational pursuits like riding or shooting. For women, the morning was devoted to household management, meeting with the housekeeper to discuss menus and supplies, checking on the servants' work, dealing with tradespeople, and to social obligations like paying calls or receiving visitors according to the strict protocols that governed such interactions. Lunch was served in the early afternoon, typically a lighter meal than breakfast or dinner. Afterwards came the afternoon calling hours, 3 to 6 o'clock, when social visits were made and received. This was also when afternoon tea might be served. The late afternoon and early evening were devoted to dressing for dinner, an elaborate process requiring time and assistance. Dinner itself, served around 7 or 8, was the main social event of the day, a formal multi-course meal lasting 2 or 3 hours. After dinner, the ladies would retire to the drawing room, while the men remained at the table with port and cigars, later rejoining the women for coffee, music, cards, or conversation. The evening might end quite late, around 11 or midnight, particularly if there were guests or if the family attended a theater or concert. This leisurely schedule was possible only for those with sufficient wealth and servants. The servants themselves experienced a very different daily rhythm, one defined by constant labor and long hours. A housemaid's day, as recorded in Victorian diaries and household management books, might begin at 5 or 6 in the morning. Her first tasks were to open shutters, clean and relay all the fireplaces, carry hot water to family members' bedrooms, and water was heavy, requiring multiple trips up and down stairs from the kitchen or basement where it had been heated. After the family breakfasted, she would clean the bedrooms, make beds, empty chamber pots. Indoor toilets did not become common until late in the period. Dust furniture, sweep floors. Throughout the day, she would be responsible for maintaining fires, answering summons from family members, serving meals, cleaning up afterward, running errands. Her evening duties included turning down beds, laying out night clothes, ensuring all the fires were safely banked for the night. She might not finish her work until 11 o'clock or even midnight, depending on the family's schedule. Other servants had equally demanding roles. The cook spent her day in the kitchen, planning menus, managing food supplies, preparing multiple elaborate meals, supervising kitchen maids and scullery maids who did the heavy work of vegetable preparation and pot washing. The butler managed the wine cellar, oversaw the male servants, served meals, answered the door, and attended to the master's personal needs. The lady's maid helped her mistress dress, a complex task given the elaborate fashions with their many buttons, laces, and layers, styled her hair, maintained her wardrobe, and accompanied her on social outings. The valet performed similar duties for the master. In large households, a strict hierarchy existed among the servants themselves, with senior servants like the housekeeper, butler, and lady's maid occupying positions of authority and relative comfort, compared to the lower servants who did the hardest physical labor. Servants had little freedom or privacy. They typically lived in the house, in small, sparsely furnished rooms in the attic or basement. Their time off might be limited to one afternoon every other week, barely enough to visit family or attend church. They were expected to be invisible when performing their duties, to anticipate the family's needs without being told, to maintain absolute discretion about family matters. The relationship between servants and employers was complex, marked by dependence and power imbalance, sometimes by genuine affection, or at least mutual respect, often by distance and indifference. For young women from working class or rural backgrounds, domestic service represented one of the few paths to respectable employment despite its hardships. For the middle class, daily life involved more work and less leisure than the upper class enjoyed, but considerably more comfort and security than the working class knew. A middle-class household might employ 1 to 3 servants, perhaps a maid-of-all-work who handled general housekeeping and cooking, possibly a nursemaid if there were young children, maybe a cook if the family could afford it. The mistress of such a household was intimately involved in its daily management, planning meals, monitoring expenses, overseeing the servants' work, and often performing some household tasks herself. Middle-class men typically worked as clerks, managers, professional men like doctors or solicitors, leaving home in the morning to travel to offices or consulting rooms, returning in the evening for dinner and family time. The working class experienced yet another daily pattern, one dominated by industrial time rather than the flexible schedules of the wealthy. Factory workers, shop assistants, laborers, their days were structured by the demands of their employment. The factory whistle or bell dictated when they must arrive, when they could break for meals, when they could leave. Work weeks were long, often 6 days, with Sunday the only day of rest. Hours were grueling. 12 or more hours per day was common early in the Victorian era, though reform movements gradually reduced this to 10 hours, then 9 for some workers. The work itself was often dangerous, monotonous, or physically exhausting. Working-class women faced particular hardships. Those who could find work as domestic servants at least had room and board provided, though they sacrificed their independence. Others worked in factories, textile mills, garment workshops, food processing, under harsh conditions for low wages. Married working-class women typically could not work outside the home, as they were responsible for all household tasks, including child care, cooking, laundry, and mending, all performed without the servants or conveniences available to wealthier women. Laundry alone was a massive undertaking, heating water, hand-washing clothing and linens, wringing them out, hanging them to dry, ironing with heavy flat irons heated on the stove. Cooking on coal-burning ranges required constant attention to maintain proper temperatures. Shopping for food meant daily trips to markets because few had space to store provisions and refrigeration did not exist. Children's experiences varied as dramatically by class as adults did. Upper-class children were raised primarily by servants, nursemaids when young, governesses for girls, tutors for boys until they went to boarding school around age 7 or 8. They might see their parents for an hour or so daily during children's hour, a scheduled visit in the drawing room, but otherwise lived in the nursery wing with their caretakers. Middle-class children had more parental involvement, but still led semi-segregated lives, often educated at home by governesses or at small local schools. Working-class children, until reform legislation began protecting them, might start working in factories or mines as young as 5 or 6 years old, contributing their small wages to the family's survival. Child labor was one of the great scandals that social reformers addressed during the Victorian era, gradually achieving laws that restricted working hours, banned the youngest children from employment, and eventually mandated school attendance. And so, this gentle tour through Victorian England settles into silence, like the last light fading across a conservatory's glass, and the final steam drifting from a silver teapot into the cool of evening. The gardens close their gates, the flower beds rest beneath the hush of dew, and the palm houses grow dim as the boilers quiet, leaving only the scent of damp earth and fern to linger in the air. Streets soften to muted echoes, where the day's markets have folded their canvas and the lamps burn steadier, casting warm ovals on brick and stone, smoothing the edges of a city that never truly sleeps, but knows how to breathe between one day and the next. In the quiet, the city's contrasts become a single thread: parks and pavements, parlors and workrooms, tea trays and timetables, bound by the steady pulse of routines that shaped a century. Across the lawns of public parks, the paths curve toward still water, and the music that filled Sunday bandstands seems to hang beyond hearing. like a memory the air still keeps. Along garden borders, geraniums and salvias hold their color a moment longer, while the roses lower their heads and the lavender cools to evening, its fragrance a last soft note. In great houses and modest terraces alike, the familiar rituals conclude. The fire is banked, the piano lid closed, the cups washed and stacked, the door fastened against the night. Even the trains, so tireless in their measured haste, seem to run more quietly under the long iron ribs of their stations, as if the architecture itself were another form of breath, drawing in and letting go with patient regularity. In these small endings lie the meanings that endure. That ordered gardens could lend calm to restless streets. That tea, poured with care, could steady the hours. That parks, with their winding walks, could teach a crowded city how to move more gently together. The empire's plants rooted themselves in unfamiliar soil. Railways stitched distant coasts to counting-house clocks, and within homes of many sizes, the measured craft of daily life gave shape to hope, duty, and repose. What remains is not only the outline of buildings or the names of those who built them, but the fragrance of seasonal bloom, the echo of a brass refrain, the warmth left in china after a final sip, traces of a world that learned to balance smoke with sunlight and routine with grace. Let the night take what is heavy and return it in lighter form by morning. Let the lawns gather dew, the glass turn silver with the breath of dawn, and the first bird song find the hedges ready to answer. If curiosity continues, it can wait politely until daybreak, as so many Victorian customs once asked it to do. For now, allow the era to rest exactly where it belongs, held in the hush between gaslight and sunrise, in the rhythm of footsteps softening on gravel, and in the comfort of a kettle cooling on a quiet stove. Good night, and may your sleep be as calm as a garden at first light, and your dreams as gentle as steam rising from a well-loved cup of tea.